Now we will proceed to the next panel, called Rethinking Energy Governance in the Age of AI. This conversation will be moderated by PJ Maykish, Senior Advisor at the Special Competitive Studies Project. Please welcome our panelists. Dr. Kimberly Budil, Director of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Niel Chatterjee, Senior Advisor at Hogan Lovells. And Mike Kuiken, Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University.
It's amazing to get seen here.
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's PJ Maykish, and the purpose of this panel is to outline a public sector strategy, speaking with three people who have distinguished and very diverse experiences in doing so. And so right away, what I'd love to do is just to let the audience get to know the three of you a little better. I would love for you guys to tell a little bit of story about how energy breakthroughs and energy generation have happened in your own career. So Kim, starting with you. Kim is a physicist, and she has over 3 decades. Yeah, a little round of applause for the physicists. I know there's a few others over here. Kim has over 3 decades of experience in the national labs. You may know, but if you don't, that under Kim's direction, the National Ignition Facility just created a star on the Earth for a billionth of a second that released 1.1 megajoules net positive. Yeah, I give it up for Livermore and the national labs for sure. What not everybody knows is that Kim worked on the predecessor to NIF. So before there was NIF, there was something called NOVA, and Kim was laboring at that as a scientist. So Kim, in all of your experience, your whole journey, the power of the national labs, how do we harness it? And maybe a story from your journey about how you saw the labs lead to some breakouts.
Thanks, PJ. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to participate. The obvious story to tell would be the fusion story, but I'm going to start with one that's slightly different. If you think about the quest to move toward carbon neutrality and to really green our energy system, one of the first big contributions that we saw in this space was really the energy efficiency revolution, which came out of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Art Rosenfeld, widely credited as the godfather of energy efficiency, decided that while we could add power capacity to the grid, we should really think about how we use energy. So we started a program that really tried to turn science and technology toward new ways to make buildings and technologies more energy efficient. So if you look at energy usage over the last 4 decades, per capita, California energy usage has been flat, while it's gone up 50% for the rest of the US.
Because it's more efficient?
Because it's so much more efficient. Yeah. And I think that ability to bring together different disciplines, large teams with different perspectives on problems, to really take a long view, not a what's a today technology, but what's a long play we could make that would really have a major impact on the system, are the kinds of problems that national labs are particularly well posed to tackle.
That's fantastic. What is the energy efficiency breakout called? What should we name it? Like, what do you call it internally when that happened at Berkeley?
The energy efficiency breakout.
Okay, right on. Very good.
Like you made, that was good.
Very good. Thank you. That's a great story. There's so many of those, and maybe some of those it would be great to see if they come out in our strategy session. Thanks so much. Niel Chatterjee, former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Niel, you've also touched many different parts of the energy generation jungle. And, question for you, in your experience and in your journey, where is someplace where you feel like this is where you learned, this is what the United States needs to do to really break out in energy? Something from your past and in your job as chairman or otherwise?
Yeah, look, it's just remarkable to me in my relatively short career in Washington, how much the energy landscape and the energy policy landscape has changed and perhaps not kept up with each other. So when I first came to Washington in the early 2000s, I was a junior aide in Congress working on the Energy Policy Act of 2003, which became EPACT 05, which is really the last time we had significant energy policy enacted by the legislative branch of our federal government. And at that time, we were contemplating things like building LNG import facilities, because there was a thought that the U.S. would be a net importer of liquefied natural gas. We didn't contemplate the fracking revolution and what that would mean for the capacity for the U.S. to be in a position to export gas. Renewables were absolutely in their infancy, and the objective around driving growth in renewables was really tied to subsidies and mandates and regulations. And we find ourselves in a place today where there's a real business case for clean energy, and that clean energy resources can compete on their own today without necessarily being beholden to some of the government policy undergirdings that were needed earlier then. You know, transmission. We didn't think about how to plan for building out electric transmission in this country and where we might have sources of energy that we hadn't previously thought about, contemplated, and how we would get that energy to where the demand for that power would be. And then demand. We've had relatively flat demand for electricity really since I got to Washington in 2002, 2003, and now we're finding ourselves in a position where, due to AI and data centers and cloud computing and vehicle electrification and building electrification and semiconductor manufacturing and a resurgence in manufacturing and crypto and Bitcoin mining, we are now having tremendous demand being placed on the system at a time that we need to maintain reliability and affordability while simultaneously decarbonizing. And what is so disheartening to me about all of this is we basically have not had an energy policy bill enacted by Congress since EPACT 05. Since then, most significant energy policy legislation has come from omnibus appropriations bills or through the tax code. And that's just no way to do energy policy. And quite frankly, when I left the legislative branch and got the opportunity to serve in a regulatory agency at FERC, what I came to recognize is it's unfair to ask unelected bureaucrats at an agency like FERC, which has limited authority based on the statutes that govern it, to make the critical decisions that really need to come from our national leaders.
Yeah, I think when we move to the strategy questions next, it's interesting to think about how does the law anticipate all of the changes on energy demand that you saw and even the rise of fracking. So it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that. Sure. Mike Kuiken, he served over 22 years as a senior staffer on the Hill. And for those who have never been there yourselves to do that, I once asked a good friend of ours, Steve Rosen at Harvard, who is the intellectual continuity of the United States in between administrations? And he said, there is a view that it is the senior staffers, that they hold the country together during transition and during times. Mike served in the Big Eight, which is sort of the senators at the heart of the national security enterprise, was a national security advisor to Senator Schumer. And Mike, it'd be really interesting to hear from your journey, some moment in your career where you saw Congress make a difference in energy production, energy efficiency.
This is, I think, the Inflation Reduction Act. Niel might challenge this. Was probably the most consequential piece of energy legislation that we've done in a very long time. And it, is obviously a gigantic investment and is going to be very impactful over the next few years. Just simple answer.
Yeah.
I actually don't challenge that at all. I agree, but it's tax incentives.
You actually said
it's tax incentives. It's not energy policy.
You said there was nothing that
the last piece of
legislation that you enacted in 2003.
Mike, what was your role in IRA?
Listen, it was a team effort, and Leader Schumer did a great job of rallying the whole caucus and making sure that there are ideas from both chambers included in it, and it was both staff and members working across various committees that pulled that thing together.
Fantastic. One of the purposes we're doing of this whole day is to actually think about what would an overall strategy look like if you took everyone's big ideas from today. And so we're going to move the panel into that time now. And so same question for all three of you. And Kim, start with you. Would just love to hear your thoughts on moves you think the nation should make to really make a public sector government's role in changing the new direction of energy. If you were to lay out some moves that are just obvious to you, things you would do, what do you think?
So the government has a few levers that it can pull to really change in any sector that it seeks to intervene in, right? So it can motivate. We heard earlier from Secretary Granholm about incentives, tax incentives, et cetera, to really drive the creation of new industries for clean tech. It can regulate, so it can help shape the environment in ways that incentivize certain types of behaviors or disincentivize certain things we're trying to stop. And it can innovate. So I sit in the National Lab System. That's our job. So we bring together large multidisciplinary teams around really hard problems. So the biggest, most complex challenges facing the nation and the world, with a really unique array of tools and facilities and capabilities that can solve problems that are going to be very difficult to do in places like startup companies. So if we take a look at something like the emerging fusion economy, there are a whole host of new fusion companies that are eager to commercialize fusion and are very excited about this administration's bold decadal vision for commercial fusion energy. What they need, though, is help in tackling some of the significant technical challenges that still remain toward commercialization of fusion. These are things like creation of new materials that can exist in these high radiation environments over a long time, understanding the fuel cycle for fusion reactors and how that's going to operate. How are we going to make the tritium fuel that goes into these reactors, and then how are we going to manage that fuel cycle? These are the problems that the national labs are very well poised to solve. What we don't have, and you heard this from several speakers earlier, is a public sector that can move at the speed that the technology is moving. So we need new mechanisms. We need new flexibility. We need new partnership models where the public sector and the private sector can work together. I mean, one thing that the U.S. is known for is our ability to do big things. When it really matters, we come together as a country and we can make immense advances in very short amounts of time. The Manhattan Project, the Moonshot, the Human Genome Project. I mean, these are really civilization-changing efforts that came out of that marriage of public sector capabilities and resources and private sector agility and speed and know-how. And this is a moment for that type of effort again. The convergence of technologies, the emergence of AI and generative AI, the capabilities we have in materials and in other large-scale facilities to really accelerate the development of new technologies, married with the urgency, the pace, and the innovation that we're seeing in the private sector, could create, in a decade or 2 decades, a meaningful step toward commercial fusion energy on the grid. I mean, that would change everything.
Right. And so government doing things the private sector is not incentivized to do or financially equipped to do.
Yes, and new mechanisms. So we need in the public sector to be able to move at the pace of the private sector, but have the flexibility to adapt as we go. So if I have to tell you on day one what I'm going to be doing on day 126 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you're not going to get a very innovative program.
Okay. Something I wonder about is we've imagined a technology competitiveness council, and you can imagine a public-private signal to the labs that might come more methodically to say, these are the 3 things the private sector most needs from you. And this is something we've imagined. Niel, so when you were at FERC or otherwise, sitting where you sit, knowing what you know, what are some obvious moves or a big move that occurred to you that the nation should take this to just totally change the way energy is generated?
Permitting reform. It is too hard to build things in this country. And the reality is that NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, is not political. It's not ideological. Americans don't want energy infrastructure in their backyards, whether it's a pipeline to deliver gas or a transmission line to deliver clean energy. And so it's just hard to build things in this country, but we need to get it done. So I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm actually very supportive of the Inflation Reduction Act, but there was a study out of Princeton that indicated that almost 80% of the projected emissions reductions expected to emanate from the IRA would not be realized if we didn't triple the pace at which we build transmission in this country. And that's why I was saying the IRA wasn't an energy bill, because you can't do those things via budget reconciliation. And the reason that Senator Joe Manchin actually had this separate sidecar that included permitting reform is because he couldn't get it through the reconciliation process. He had to go through regular order because it wasn't budgetary in nature. But we really do need to build more infrastructure in this country, both pipelines to facilitate the deployment of natural gas for export and for electric generation on top of heat domestically, but also transmission lines. But it gets tricky. There's real complex moral questions around things like environmental justice. The easiest way to build infrastructure in this country would be to use existing right-of-ways, to build through the same communities where we've already built infrastructure in the past. As an academic exercise, I think I can make the case, well, yes, we're sorry, community. We've built through your backyard before, and we're going to build through it again. But this time, we're going to build a transmission line that is going to enable the retirement of a higher polluting source of power generation, which will lead to cleaner air and cleaner water over the course of time. So please let us come through your yard again. As an academic exercise, maybe I could sell that. As a real-world exercise, very tough sell. The other challenge is who pays for this? These are huge, high CapEx investments. And we're talking about long-haul transmission here. So you've got state A, where you have a lot of renewable generation. You have state C, where you have a lot of demand for power. What happens to ratepayers in state B? As an academic exercise, I could very credibly make the case that ratepayers in state B are receiving the benefit of alleviated transmission congestion, which is a very real benefit. But as a real-world exercise, going to ratepayers in state B and saying, we're going to build a transmission line through your backyard that you don't want, you're not going to benefit from neither the generation nor the consumption of the power, and we're going to make you pay for it, it's a really, really difficult sell. And to be totally honest, having been in that seat myself at FERC, having engaged with my state regulatory counterparts, I had multiple state regulators come to me and say, Niel, we would love it if FERC would just roll us, and because that's the only way we can get transmission built in our community. But I can't say that aloud. I'll be eviscerated. And I'm like, that's unfair to put that on me. Why do I have to be the one that gets eviscerated? These are things that should not be put in the hands of federal regulators or state regulators. We need leadership from Congress. I have been encouraged, and Senator Schumer's been involved, that there's been a concerted bipartisan effort to do permitting reform legislation in the Senate. And I am crossing my fingers and hoping to all hope that in the lame duck session, we might be able to get some movement there. Because honest to God, that is the single most important thing we can do in the face of everything we're facing on the energy landscape.
Niel, those tensions that you lay out almost like cultural federalism tensions. You could design some of those out with permit reform in your mind. That would be the goal. You design some of those tensions out somehow through legislation.
You spell it out.
Okay.
This is who pays, this is how, this is why, this is the formula, this is the process for judicial review. We're going to work through, we want to make sure the communities and their interests are protected, but that there aren't unnecessary burdens put up in place that prohibit us from building this necessary infrastructure. Think about the nation's highway system. It wasn't popular when we were building out highways, but we needed highways to grow as a country. We need transmission lines, we need pipelines for our energy future. We just got to figure out how to get it done.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Niel.
So you're going to try to drag me into permitting reform, PJ?
Only if you wish.
No.
No, I mean, I think maybe you saw something left on the cutting room floor when you were doing IRA. Maybe it was something you thought, this is too hard to do now, but 2 years from now, what the nation really needs is X.
I'll answer your question. I'm going to get there.
Yeah.
So I like Kim answers a lot. Anytime you talk to the Department of Defense about sort of research and development, they always break it down from 6.1 basic research through 6.5, which is the more advanced and sort of ready for deployment. The way I think about the energy industry is very similar, which is there are basic 6.1 research projects that we must invest in. These are projects of the future. These are projects or bets that we can make that may pay off or may not pay off, but we know there's potential for them. We should be making those investments every day. The national labs do some extraordinary work here. I visited Livermore and the other national labs over the years, and there are good people that are doing incredible work. There's also a responsibility to take the existing technologies we have and make them better. And that's a place where You can do that through investments. You can do that through policy changes, and Congress can do all those things. There's also plenty of areas where the executive branch gets in its own way and creates regulations that prevent the executive branch from doing things. We need to identify those things in that space where existing capabilities are deployed. And then we also need to think about leap ahead technologies. Fusion is an area where I know SCSP has invested a lot of energy, thought energy, and I know Kim and I are on this Scaling Fusion Commission, and there's real opportunity there too. And so the government has a responsibility, I think, to act in all those spaces. It's always a public-private partnership. It's finding opportunities where companies are prepared to sort of make a gamble on the government and where the government's prepared to make a gamble on a company. I also think this is an area where infrastructure issues come in. Some of the most incredible things you'll ever see at the national labs are these test facilities they have, all kinds of issues. And sometimes they're very specific and narrow test facilities. Sometimes they're sort of broader test use facilities. That's an area where the government has a unique ability to build these incredible facilities where researchers, companies, and others can come in and sort of tinker with things and figure out whether or not their idea is going to work. That kind of test and evaluation infrastructure is critical. It's critical as we think about fusion. It's critical as we think about the existing technologies that are out there. And that's an area where I think the government has a very unique role. I think permitting reform is a very important conversation. Tax incentives are an important part of the conversation, but government, just simple dollars going into government programs that can enable industry or can partner with industry are incredibly important. And that's an area where Congress has sort of a unique and very powerful role with the power of the purse. And so that's the area I always think about when I sort of hear questions like you have. And I think Tim did a great job to sort of highlight those all very well.
Yeah, in review, I'm just going to summarize those three and do the best I can, and tell me if it triggers something else or you want to take off on that, anyone. So first is the idea that government can cover down on the private sector for things they can't do or not positioned to do by themselves. Second, there's some mechanism that would be needed to forge that public-private partnership. Sometimes that's done by big programs. Manhattan, Apollo, 81% of everything that was done in Apollo from 67 to 69 was on contract with the private sector. So there's either some bold Manhattan project or some mechanism that lets you get the signal from the private sector. Permit reform, and just the idea of that as a monstrous thing that could be tackled, should be tackled methodically. Some of those issues that you ran through so nicely, Niel, could be designed out by legislation. And then the idea, Mike, that we could approach R&D in this really methodical way of what's needed now, what's needed long-term in a 6-1 through 6-5 kind of mentality. And the challenge there, we often find, is that the energy plans come by energy, not by sector, because it's so massive. And then the idea that tax incentives are always a thing. And so from reviewing those, I mean, that sounds like if the United States did that, that's not a bad plan. Does it trigger anything else?
So PJ, people have talked a lot about Apollo projects, Manhattan projects over the last little while. It is very difficult to get big slugs of money through Congress. The executive branch obviously submits a budget every year. There's arguments over top line, then there's the argument over defense versus non-defense. There are lots of tools that the executive branch has available to it. Indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, or IDIQ contracts, and all kinds of other Defense Production Act tools that the executive branch can deploy on an incremental basis to get to some of these things. They could do that on fusion if they wanted to. They could do it on data centers. They could do it on compute. They could do it in all of these spaces. But it does take, you're talking about sort of the courage to roll the state regulators. It does take people in positions that are willing to roll or take some heat. And sometimes that is very difficult. You don't know the outcome. Everyone has Solyndra in their mind all the time. And so it's a very complicated scenario for folks in the executive branch as they think and evaluate the tools that they have available to them, all of which, interestingly, are Cold War tools that were designed to do bold things. So it's something just always to keep in mind as you think about sort of the power in the purse and the other available tools that are out there.
I think it's just on that specific point, what you outlined actually is sort of a public partnership, executive branch and the legislative branch coming together and really acknowledging and embracing the risks attended with some of these investments. There are things that are going to go wrong. There are bets we're going to make in technology space that don't pan out exactly the way we plan. And so having that agreement up front that we agree that the risk is worth taking and we're going to share it, much like the permitting question, we're going to share this risk, we're going to acknowledge up front who owns which parts of it, and then hopefully we'll all be celebrating at the end of this process. If things aren't working in the direction we think they should, we'll make course corrections. And for me, that's this idea of flexibility where instead of avoiding the risk, we acknowledge it and then we find a way to work through it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The number of times I've taken a briefing over the years about a program, and you sort of get the briefing on the program, Kim, and you sort of immediately say, well, why didn't we do this? We knew if we got this far in the program, why didn't we take the next step? And they're like, well, Congress would light us up for failing. And so you're absolutely right. There is that sort of, there is a way to have that conversation where you accept the risk, you accept the potential for failure. It's obviously a very difficult scenario to work out, but it is something to always think about.
I agree with both of them completely. And I have an answer to this, honestly, and I speak to it from the energy space. And I'm being serious. I don't say this to be funny or flippant. We need to make energy policy boring again. When energy policy is really boring and you allow the nerds to handle it, you get constructive outcomes without all of this ancillary drama. And what has happened is, over the course of the last couple of decades, energy policy has gotten really interesting. And suddenly, politicians and celebrities and CEOs are making decisions about things like resource adequacy that used to be made by physicists and by engineers. And suddenly, the physicists and the engineers have been taken out of the equation, and these decisions are being made by politicians. Mike just laid out like really smart, competent policy ideas that could move forward, but why can't they? Because Congress would light us up. Why would Congress light us up? Because of politics. We gotta take the politics out of this stuff. And maybe I'm being Pollyannish-ly naive here, but I am an optimist. I actually think the smartest thing the Inflation Reduction Act did was invest in the domestic supply chain for a clean energy future. And what that could do, if it plays out correctly, is create a paradigm in which we have red supply feeding blue demand. And if we actually get to that scenario, maybe we can start taking some of the politics out of energy and decarbonization and re-empower the physicists and the engineers to make the constructive decisions we need to make to go forward. But I heard what both of them said. I agreed with it completely. And the reason that they couldn't get to yes in either of their scenarios is politics. We got to get the politics on.
Because it's become too interesting.
It's too interesting. We got to get boring. Now, it'll be worse for me. You guys won't want to come see me on panels, but better for America.
Well, and I think
I was literally just going to say, I think the sponsors of the event put us in white leather chairs with neon lights on purpose.
you missed the most important point, which is getting the physicists more involved in the decision making. I really applaud that.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Mike, you had mentioned how difficult it is to get large-scale things done.
Chips is an example of something like that. We have said to ourselves, the NASA law will probably never happen again in our lifetime, which is unlimiting budgeting authority to get to the moon and back. Unlikely to happen in our lifetime. But chips did happen. Why did chips happen? And how could, it doesn't have to be 52 billion. You could do a big program in energy for 10, you know? So why do you think it's not possible? Or why do you think it's just hard, is really what you said.
It's hard. Listen,
yeah.
It was, Leader Schumer and Senator Young came together. He was then the Democratic leader. In, I think, 2017, early 2018, to start with the Endless Frontier Act, which ultimately turned into Chips and Science. And listen, it was a multi-year campaign. All through COVID, me and one of my former colleagues sat on Zooms with everyone that would listen to us about that. Leader Schumer did the same thing. Senator Young did the same thing. I'm sure Senator Young took his licks inside of that Republican caucus just based on the dollar amount. So those things are hard. They are multi-year campaigns. That was a public-private partnership in that there were members of both chambers of Congress that teamed up with industry to think about this from a strategic perspective. And then, of course, there was a huge motivating factor that put wind at our backs every day, which is the threat of China. That was also a gigantic rallying call for members.
It's a good description of the equation that led to it. It's a really great description.
This whole operation is being run behind the scenes by a former Air Force officer, so we must end on time. But But as a result, that is the amount of time we have to still engage with the audience. What I'd love to do is just give you three the floor. In the audience here, we have directors of labs like yourself, Kim. We have former directors of lab. Thomas is here, now at AMD, used to lead Oak Ridge. We have companies who are trying to lead a fusion revolution and need a lot of help for the kinds of very things that you've talked about, Kim. They probably need, Niel, a lot of help from permit reform. I know one of them leads a voluntary group called the Factory Plant, because there's people who have to build factories. They have to get together to share best practices because it's hard. So knowing the full diversity, you've got students here, you have people who have trained down, met a student just recently who trained down from New Haven. So with everybody here, I just want to give the three of you the floor to think about the nation's energy future. Illy laid out this morning message from Bill Gates about how AI will just completely, potentially 10x the energy demand. What would you love to lay out as just a positive vision of what the nation could do? Mike, I'll start with you, and Kim, we'll let you bring us home.
I'm just riffing here?
Yes. Because you're capable of that.
Yeah, no, listen, as I think about it, one of my side gigs here, and I'm not here to represent them today, is on the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission. And one of the things, one of the hearings that they had before I joined the commission this year were areas of strategic competition with China: quantum, bio, fusion, and AI. And as you think about all those spaces, as you think of all the things that Kim and Niel and I sort of talked about, those are all places where we need to think about public-private partnerships, where we can use sort of existing authorities to make sure that government is doing all they can to accelerate these technology developments. And we have to do these things all very quickly. No one should lose sight of the fact that next year is 2025. There's a Made in China 2025 plan. They'll be reevaluating that next year. And I think one of the things that the commission did a few years ago was, in 2017, was actually show the plan that China laid out for itself. And by all accounts, they are running at pace. And so when we think about funding decisions, when we think about policy decisions, when we think about things the executive branch can do unilaterally, we have to all sort of look at all those things with a view towards what our sort of strategic adversary is doing and how they're thinking about the problem set, where they're making investments, and honestly, where they're stealing our intellectual property, and how we can address that very real threat as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. Niel,
I'll be quick. I've got two things I want to touch on. First, what I laid out earlier, we really are facing a very complex challenge in this country where we have to meet this amazing surge in demand that is coming while maintaining reliability and affordability while simultaneously decarbonizing. And that may seem like a really daunting task, but the reason I'm optimistic we can solve that task and step up to it is because at the end of the day, it's a math problem. And you know who can solve math problems? Physicists. And so I feel good about that. But there's a secondary component that I did want to touch on that I think touches on both of their expertise. And that's something that those of us in the energy space haven't contemplated to a great deal. And that's the importance of cybersecurity and physical security. It's something that we don't take into consideration enough. And when we talk about, relationships with China and Russia and our adversaries, I was called hyperbolic a little bit when I was at FERC because I made a comment that we're at a point in 21st century warfare that owners and operators of critical energy infrastructure are now on the front lines of 21st century warfare. People are like, what are you talking about?
Colonial,
what does that even mean?
like the Colonial Pipeline.
So that's a perfect example. If the Colonial Pipeline had been hit by a missile, we would have very clearly understood that to be an act of terrorism or war, and we would have known how to respond accordingly. But because it was the victim of a ransomware attack, I'm not quite certain we responded in the same way. But the reality is the economic and national security implications of that ransomware attack were every bit as significant as if it had been hit by a missile. And so we all just need to collectively recognize that this is a threat, that our adversaries are watching us, and that we need to work together, public, private, state, federal, to stay ahead of our adversaries.
Fantastic. Thank you, Niel. Kim, final thoughts for the group.
2 minutes, Kim.
What? Oh,
In Senate time, that's like an hour.
that's the kind of public-private partnership.
A little teamwork.
One Well, there are many hopeful signs just by the group of people that are sitting in this room and the sense of purpose and urgency that is behind the questions we're asking ourselves today. How are we going to take advantage of this moment? I think Niel's point that he just made is really important. These are not just issues of economic security. These are issues of national security. And leadership matters. Leadership in science matters. Leadership in technology matters. Leadership in key industries matters. You know, being leaders in the energy industries that we are creating and sustaining and advancing that leadership is important. And so I want people to go into this next decade with a sense of optimism because of the tools and the knowledge we have at hand to really make a difference, a sense of real ambition about what's possible, because we will not get there if you cannot say aloud the kinds of goals that we have. If we want a commercial fusion, ecosystem, then you have to say that and work toward it. And I'll just close with the hopeful story Mike told about chips and science. I mean, having a good idea is not enough. It takes work, and it takes time, and it takes relationships, and it takes, building partnerships to make things happen. And so if we really embrace this, if we really come together as a community, we can make amazing things happen. I am confident.
Fantastic. Just to conclude the role of government in thinking about energy generation, I just want to say, personally, thank you. Each one of you has put in the work, has done the hard things, has done federal service, each one of you totally in a different way. I just want to say, while we're in front of everybody, thank you for what you've done. Thank you for your thoughts today. We're going to put them into work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.